Hello, welcome to the fifth session of Unit 1, which is the Introduction to International Trade. My name is Elias. So in this video, I'm going to take you through the modern theories. Okay, so we'll look at the modern theory of international trade, where we'll bring in the indifference curves, the offer curves, and so on, and then describe the terms of trade. So let's begin by looking at the community indifference curves and how they are related in terms of with the production possibility frontier in terms of determining the trade position of any given country. So a community indifference curve by description shows the various combinations of two commodities that yield equal satisfaction to the community or the nation. What this is that we are looking at different points of consumption for any given country or any given community, and upon the consumption we see that the levels of utility or satisfaction for that community will be unchanged along a given frontier. So as opposed to looking at a simple indifference curve, here we are looking at the indifference curve for the entire nation or the community in general. However, it should be noted that the properties of the community indifference curve maintains those for just standard individual consumers indifference curve. So we see the properties that number one, higher curves refer to a higher level of satisfaction, meaning if you are on a lower indifference curve, your satisfaction levels are low, and if you're on a higher indifference curve, your satisfaction levels as a nation are higher. Secondly, the community indifference curves are downward sloping or negatively sloped, which means that we are moving from top left corner down to the bottom right corner, which is the horizontal axis. And this will tell you then that the community indifference curves are convex to the origin. Okay, so the declining slope of the curves reflect the diminishing marginal rate of substitution of x for y, and that they are convex from the origin. And finally, they should not cross because of the principle of transitivity. If they cross, it means they will make it difficult for us to do an analysis. Therefore, we make these four properties to simplify our model and be able to work with indifference curves. Okay, so let's consider the indifference curves for nation 1 and nation 2. So on the left panel, we have indifference curves for nation 1, and that we have different points, point A all the way to point A and N on indifference curve 1, H and T on indifference curve 2, and then E on indifference curve 3. Given the properties we looked at earlier, that higher indifference curves yield more satisfaction compared to lower indifference curves, it means that point E here has more utility for the nation compared to point T, H, N, and A. And A and N have lower utility levels compared to H, T, and E. But it should be noted that A and the N have equal utility levels for the nation. Therefore, higher indifference curves yield higher satisfaction to the consumers in a given nation. We also looked at the slope, that the slope of the indifference curve is downward or negative, which shows that we are moving from top left to right bottom. And then this tells us about the diminishing marginal rate of substitution, and that they are convex to show that the more you are moving down the curve, it means the less willing you will be to give up the units of y. In other words, the more you are moving down the curve towards the horizontal axis, the more useful the commodity y will be. Okay, so this is the structure, and therefore we are also saying that they should never cross, because let's make an assumption here. Suppose that we had another indifference curve here, which we can call indifference curve 4. So I4. So you will notice that if we had a point here and another point here, let's call this point Z, and let's call this one point Q. Clearly we see that point Z and point E are on the same indifference curve 4, and therefore they yield the same satisfaction to the community. In the same way, Q and E are on the same indifference curve 3, and therefore they yield the same satisfaction to the community. You will notice that Q and E are on indifference curve 3. Z and E are on indifference curve 4, but E is on both 3 and 4, which means that if that be the case, then Z and Q should also yield equal satisfaction to the consumer. But we see that these two are on different indifference curves, and therefore it distorts the analysis in knowing which one is on a higher indifference curve or which one is on a lower indifference curve. Because from this side, you will notice that Z appears to be on a lower indifference curve, and this appears to be up. On the other side, this part, indifference curve 4, appears to be on top, and 3 appears to be at the bottom. So to keep the analysis simple, we assume that indifference curves must not cross. Okay, so with that, then the slope of the indifference curve is what we call the marginal rate of substitution, which is the rate of the marginal rate of substitution of X for Y in consumption refers to the amount of Y that a nation could give up for one extra unit of X and still remain on the same indifference curve. In other words, it's the rate at which one commodity can be substituted for the other in consumption and still leave utility unchanged. So, if the community decides to consume more of X and less of Y, given the indifference curve, it means that their satisfaction levels will not change. What will change is the rate of substitution as they move down or up the curve respectively. And as such, the slope of the indifference curve therefore is given by the absolute value or absolute slope of the indifference curve at the point of consumption, and this diminishes as we move down the curve. Therefore, the marginal rate of substitution for a convex indifference curve diminishes as we move down the curve. Okay, so we looked at those 2 points. That's a point A and point N. That if you look at it here, point A is on a lower side, while point N is on an upper side, but still on the same indifference curve. So as you move down here, the slope at point A will be lower compared to the slope at point N. Because if you draw a tangent line here, it will be relatively steeper, and if you draw it here, it will be flatter. And as such, we see that the slope at point A is smaller compared to the slope at point N. This explains that the marginal rate of substitution, which is the slope of an indifference curve, diminishes as we move down the curve. Okay, so let's continue with our analysis. Let's look at equilibrium in isolation. Now, in isolation or in autarky, a nation is in equilibrium when it reaches the highest indifference curve possible given its production frontier. In other words, a nation will have a defined production possibility frontier, PPF, and then out of this we'll have different indifference curves. So this one has crossed. Let me try to draw one which will be tangent. Okay, something like that. Okay, so we see that among all these indifference curves, okay, let me just try to redraw this so that we make it more clear. So we have our PPF, and then we have our indifference curve 1, and we have our indifference curve 2, okay, and indifference curve 3. So 1, 2, and 3. So from here we see that the nation's production possibility frontier is tangent to indifference curve 2, meaning that in isolation or in autarky, the nation is in equilibrium at point A. Let's call this point A. Any other point will not be the equilibrium point for the nation. It should be noted that the nation is able to produce and consume at this point here, but however, because at this point, which we can call point B, the nation is underutilizing the resources, and therefore it will not be maximizing the utility of the citizens in that nation. In the same way, the nation will have to increase their resources for it to be able to produce on indifference curve 4. Therefore, the only point of equilibrium is point A. So, the common slope of the two curves at the tangency point gives the internal equilibrium relative commodity price in the nation and reflects the nation's comparative advantage. So, we're going to see this on this graph and how this is done. So consider nation 1 and nation 2, and each is in isolation or in autarky. Nation 1 is in equilibrium at point A, where the community indifference curve 1 is, or I, is tangent to the nation's production possibility frontier. And at that point, nation 1 is producing 50 units of X and 60 units of Y. The consumption levels shows that the nation 1 is consuming 50 of X and 60 of Y in autarky. So to get the slope, remember we said you draw a tangent line and then you measure the slope at that point. So at this point, if we measure the slope of this line, we find that the slope is 1/4. And this 1/4 defines the internal relative commodity price. Okay, or which we call the domestic terms of trade. If we move to nation 2, we see that nation 2 is in equilibrium at A prime when it's in autarky. And at this point, the slope of the indifference curve as well as the PPF at that point is 4, which is simply the inverse, the reciprocal of nation 1's terms of trade. Therefore, from these two, we see that nation 1 has a comparative advantage in the production of X because the relative commodity price, the autarky terms of trade, is smaller compared to that of nation 2. And as such, nation 2 has a comparative advantage in the production of Y. And if we allow the two nations to trade, to specialize, it means that nation 1 will specialize in the production of commodity X and move to point B, and then nation 2 will specialize in the production of commodity Y and also move to point B there, where the terms of trade for the two nations will be equal. And only at that point will the nation cease to have comparative advantage. Okay, so note that at point A, the marginal rate of transformation, which is the slope of the PPF, is equal to the marginal rate of substitution, which is the slope of the indifference curve, must be equal to the relative commodity prices, and this will be equal to 1/4 in nation 1. That's why we have put this superscript here 1 to show that we are talking about nation 1. Okay, so for nation 2, we see that it's actually the reciprocal of nation 1's terms of trade. And the marginal rate of transformation in nation 2 is equal to the marginal rate of substitution in nation 2. And in autarky, this is equal to 4. And if we compare the two, we see that nation 1 has a comparative advantage in the production of commodity X, and nation 2 has a comparative advantage in the production of commodity Y. Okay, thank you very much for watching. If you have questions, please send an email to muauelias@gmail.com. I'll see you in session 6 where we'll continue with the modern theories.